All right, in this lesson, we're going to go into Book 2 of the Republic and just go over the arguments that appear there. The first thing is Glaucon, who gives a reformulation of the problem of injustice. So at the end of Book 1, we saw that Thrasymachus was refuted by Socrates, and then Socrates goes on this speech that he calls greedy, where he's indulgent, and he just sort of indulges in this idea that about the good and about justice, and Thrasymachus is not prepared for it. And after it, Glaucon basically says, we're not satisfied with what you said. You didn't persuade us, and in order to be persuaded, we are going to, I say we, Glaucon and Adeimantus both together, we're going to give a defense of injustice in order to get Socrates to come back into the conversation and give a defense of justice. And that defense of justice, which Socrates gives after this, will comprise the rest of the Republic. So the rest of the Republic will be Socrates giving his defense of justice in response to this formulation or reformulation of the problem of injustice by Glaucon. So Glaucon says, and Glaucon is here drawing just on public opinion of what people believe in Athens. He says that he, for himself, thinks that there is justice, but he isn't sure how to argue for it, and he's heard so many people talking about how justice isn't real that he has been sort of brainwashed by public opinion about injustice. And so he says, all right, I'll give you the best portrait of justice and injustice that I can, as I've gotten it from public opinion. So he says most people basically think that justice is a mean between good and bad. It's a kind of inconvenient compromise which people make. So the good here that justice is in between is doing injustice. And this is echoing Thrasymachus, right? So what is good is to just get away with taking advantage of other people. And what is bad is suffering injustice from other people. So being taken advantage of. And so between these options of taking advantage of people and having other people take advantage of you, justice is a middle ground. And also on the side of the bad is being punished, right? So doing injustice and getting away with it, and doing injustice and being punished, but also suffering injustice. So it's somewhere between these two options, right? So this is the idea that Glaucon gives as the common popular view of justice. And he clarifies this. So here we see Glaucon living up to his name, the gleaming-eyed, wise Glaucon. He gives us a very philosophical analysis of this problem. He says that, well, there are really three ways in which we mean something is good. There are three kinds of goods. First of all, there is good in relation to activity. Then there's good in relation to consequences. And then there's a good that is both the activity and the consequences. So let's look at these really quick. Good for its activity are things that are pleasurable or enjoyable or desirable, but not in terms of their consequences, only in terms of the participation in them. So these are things like harmless pleasures, like smelling a flower. Like you smell a flower, and while you smell it, it's enjoyable, it brings pleasure, but then you walk away, and it's not as if something in you has changed. There's no consequence of it. Maybe it lightens your mood or something like that, but you don't do it for the consequence. You do it for the activity. So while you're participating in it. And this becomes more clear with the second example. So things that are good for their consequence, but not for their activity. So that would be something like going to the doctor, right? You go to the doctor and they do all these things to you that are uncomfortable and can even hurt and things like that. You have a wound and it needs to be stitched up. The stitches is an activity, and you don't desire that activity. You desire the outcome, to have a healed wound. And exercise can be like that as well. Anything where you don't want to do the thing, maybe listening to these lectures and learning in school sometimes is like that. It's not about the activity, but about the consequence, whether the consequence is a grade or learning or whatever it is. Hopefully it's learning, because that would be genuine. And not just about a grade. So that's the second kind of good. Things where we desire the consequence but not the activity. So third, we have a good which incorporates both, which holds the both together. So thinking and health are the main examples here. So health is a kind of activity. It's a being healthy. It's a maintaining yourself in health. And so that activity is something desirable. And also a healthy disposition is able to sustain itself. It's able to preserve itself. And therefore it's capable of bringing about health as a consequence. So here we desire it both for its activity and for its consequence. And thinking follows in an analogous way. So in a way, we have a revival of Thrasymachus' argument. So Thrasymachus gives us this kind of conventional view of what justice is, and now we have it reformulated by Glaucon and given this kind of philosophical backing that Thrasymachus lacked. So it's a kind of inconvenience. And then we get this beautiful image or kind of fable about the ring of Gyges. And here there are so many like Lord of the Rings reference, kind of Lord of the Rings references this, obviously. It's kind of a mythological fantasy story, right? And Glaucon gives it as a way of getting an idea of what they're talking about. The myth functions as a way of thinking about the whole problem at once, right? So the plot and the story pulls you in, it sucks you in to be able to grasp the idea as a whole. And this is another reason that Glaucon represents a kind of philosophical disposition and a philosophical ability. As we'll see next week, Socrates is going to give us several images and myths and allegories and things like that. And what they do is they give you a glimpse at the underlying meaning of the thing in a kind of false way. So they give this false story about this guy who gets a ring and who can be invisible, and it's a fantastical story. But underlying that fantastical element, there are deeper truths that it shows to us. And so this ability to kind of craft these stories is linked with the kind of genius of the philosopher in the Republic. So here we see Glaucon really exhibiting that by the ring of Gyges. And I'm not going to go into this story because we've already seen that in a previous video, but I'm going to kind of give you the takeaway message of it. So what the ring of Gyges shows us is that if you're able to get away with injustice, if there were some device like this ring that guarantees you will not be caught for being unjust, well, anyone who's in that situation would be unable to cave and would be unable to use the ring for anything but personal advantage, and would even if maybe they used it to like fight crime or something like that, there would still be moments when they would be sucked into doing injustice. And what this is supposed to show us is that injustice is more choice-worthy. It's more desirable. So we all desire to take advantage of each other. And if we had something that would prevent us from getting caught, we would all do that. That's the idea of the Ring of Gyges. So the mythological gathering in this idea points us towards this idea about injustice, that no one would choose to act justly if they didn't have to. So what that shows is that if no one would if no one could choose to act justly in this situation, that must be because injustice is really inherently more choice-worthy. And so here Glaucon gives us this portrait of perfect injustice, and it's put into a kind of lively, colorful way of being presented here, rather than just giving it in a dry, philosophical, propositional way. But so after the Ring of Gyges, he then clarifies it in a more philosophical way. He says, I've completed these two portraits of justice and injustice. They're like statues or paintings. And Socrates makes a joke about how colorful they are and how vivid. And what the axis on which they turn is this distinction between seeming and being. So the whole way he completes these pictures of justice and injustice is by saying that the just person, the completely just person, will be just, so being just, while seeming unjust. So he gives this report of what this person's life was like. They're being tortured. They're getting all of the worst. They have a terrible reputation, basically. So they've done justice their entire life. They've never acted in any way out of self-interest or anything except for the common good. And they get no recognition for it, and they are tortured, and they suffer all of these misfortunes. And here we can actually think of Socrates. So Socrates is said to be just, and yet he seemed unjust to the point where he was put to death, right? And we remember also from the Apology this question of seeming and being, that people who fear death seem to be wise while being unwise. So this question of seeming and being is really at the heart of Plato's philosophical analysis, and we see it coming up here in Glaucon. So then complete injustice, the completely unjust person, is someone basically more or less like Gyges, who has this ability to do all of these terrible things, commit injustices, and get no punishment, and be completely undetected. So they seem to be the most just while being completely unjust. So they take advantage of everyone, there's no consequences for their action, and they get away with cruelty, violence, and injustice and these things. And so this is the ultimate portrait of what justice and injustice are, given by Glaucon in Book 2. And then Adeimantus comes in and says, well, you've only given half of the account. What you're missing is the half that relates to death and the gods. So Adeimantus thinks that he's actually enhancing here Glaucon's account. He says, this unjust person who has got away with all of these things, they seem to be just while being unjust, they haven't fooled the gods. The gods see that they've been unjust. So how can this person avoid the retribution for their injustice in the afterlife? Well, they will get away with it by the amount of money that they receive in their lifetime. They will be able to use that in order to pay off their debt to the gods. So because they will be able to collect all of this, money and property and things like that by taking advantage of other people, they will then be able to pay off the gods. So even if they, act unjustly and can't avoid the kind of objective appraisal of them in the afterlife, where they're being judged for all of their actions and nothing goes unseen, well, they can also get away with that because they can just pay off the gods. So there's no reason, basically, if you can get away with injustice, to not choose it, because even the gods will let you off if you are able to pay them off. So after all of this, Socrates says that he is so moved by these speeches given by the sons of Ariston, which again is Plato's father, the family of Plato, because they're his brothers, but also this idea of greatness. Ariston means greatness. So he says basically, wow, these sons of greatness have given these speeches about injustice, and I know that neither of them actually believes what they said. They gave these speeches in order to inspire me to give a speech about justice and defend justice, but they have defended injustice far better than Thrasymachus, who actually believes these things. They have done a better job. So in a way, Socrates is saying, look how philosophical they have been. They have made the weaker argument stronger in order that we can actually analyze it and understand it, right? So this is getting back to that irony from the Apology. Part of the job of philosophy is to make the weaker argument stronger in order to be able to understand it and deconstruct it and take it apart properly. So he says, I feel compelled now to give a speech in defense of justice. And in order to do that, this is a really weird thing that Socrates says. He says, in order to do that, what's going to be easiest is if we try to look to some really big example, because it's going to be hard to see justice as if it was like, if justice in the soul is like a very small print, we're not going to be able to read it. So we're going to have to look at something bigger, a larger example. And what larger example do we have? Cities. So there's justice in the individual and there's justice in the city, but the city is big, so it's going to be easy to look at. Now, I say that this is a strange, weird idea because a city is way more complicated, potentially, right? It has so many more facets, and a city is made up of individual souls. So instead of having to look at individual souls, which are small and hard to see, now we're looking at a whole cluster of them. How is that easier? It doesn't make sense. And it actually proves to be much more difficult, a much more difficult task. And that's what we get. Socrates dives straight in. He says, okay, in order to do this, it's going to be easier to look at a city and see how a city comes into being. And in order to see how a city comes into being, we can do it through speech. We can give a speech about the coming into being of the city. And in this way, we can see how justice comes to be and where injustice is and what the sources of justice and injustice are by looking to a larger example in a city.